The stagecoach lurches, a final bone-jarring shudder before the metallic shriek of the brake lever signals its arrival. Dust, thick as milled flour, billows and settles, coating the weary passengers and the parched, sun-baked street of Redemption Gulch. A woman steps down, one hand clutching a worn carpet bag, the other pressed tight against a bundle swaddled in a thick shawl, held close to her chest as if shielding it from the harsh glare of the afternoon sun, or perhaps from the equally harsh stares of the few onlookers. She is younger than the grit and travel weariness suggest, her eyes wide and haunted, scanning the small assembly for a face she knows only from a faded tintype and a handful of sparsely worded letters. This is Sarah, and the bundle is not merely luggage. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. Her heart hammers a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She spots him almost immediately, a tall, lean figure detaching himself from the shade of the general store's porch. He matches the image, older perhaps, weathered by sun and wind, his clothes plain but clean. This is Elias Thorne, the rancher who answered her advertisement, the man who offered her a new life in exchange for companionship and help on his remote holding. The bundle in her arms seems to grow heavier, hotter. This is the moment of truth, the precipice. As he approaches, his gaze steady and unreadable, she feels a tremor of panic. The child, her Lily, stirs faintly beneath the shawl, a tiny whimper escaping that sounds as loud as a gunshot in the sudden quiet. Sarah's breath catches. She must speak, must confess before he discovers it himself, before the hopeful, fragile understanding they'd built through letters shatters. He stops a few feet away, his eyes, the color of faded denim, finally settling on the bulky shape she holds. A flicker of something unidentifiable crosses his face. She opens her mouth, words of apology and desperate explanation tumbling out. Mr. Thorne, there's something I should have told you. I wasn't entirely forthcoming. Her voice is a raw whisper. The onlookers, sensing drama, draw subtly closer. He continues to look, not at her face, but at the bundle. Then, as she fumbles with the shawl, ready to reveal the small sleeping face within, he speaks, his voice low and calm, cutting through her stammered confession. I know, ma'am. He lifts his gaze to meet hers, and a ghost of a smile touches his lips, a smile that holds no condemnation, only a quiet acceptance, and it changes nothing. Welcome home, Sarah. Welcome home, little one. Elias Thorne had cultivated solitude like a stubborn crop. His ranch, nestled in a high valley miles from Redemption Gulch, was a testament to years of hard labor, a solitary endeavor since Martha, his wife, had been taken by the fever 5 years prior. He hadn't sought another partner, the silence of his cabin a familiar, if somber, companion. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had been an impulse, a sudden yearning for a human presence that wasn't just the echo of his own footsteps, a practical need for help as the seasons turned and the work never lessened. Sarah's letters had been hesitant, careful, but possessed an underlying current of intelligence and, he'd thought, honesty. She'd written of wanting a new start, of being capable and willing to work. She hadn't mentioned a child. Yet, he knew, a second letter had arrived a week after he'd sent his own agreeing to her passage. It was anonymous, the handwriting hurried and spidery, posted from the same town as Sarah's. It spoke of a young woman in desperate straits, a recent widow with a babe in arms, ostracized and with nowhere to turn. It didn't name Sarah, but the details, the timing, it had been her. The letter writer, Perhaps a sympathetic friend or a guilt-ridden acquaintance had pleaded for whoever her correspondent might be to show compassion. Elias had read it, then reread Sarah's own letters, searching for nuances he'd missed. He found only a quiet dignity. He'd almost burned the anonymous missive, almost written back to Sarah to call the whole thing off. But then he'd thought of Martha, of the cradle he'd built that had never been used, tucked away in the loft. He'd thought of the echoing silence. He'd made his decision then, a quiet resolution in the solitude of his kitchen. Sarah, for her part, had spent the last leg of the journey in a torment of fear and shame. Lily, her precious daughter, barely 6 months old, was the reason she'd answered the advertisement, the reason she'd clung to this desperate hope of a new life. Her husband, a young store clerk full of dreams, had died suddenly, leaving her penniless and at the mercy of his stern, unforgiving parents who saw Lily as a burden. A shameful reminder of their son's improvident marriage. Fleeing their cold charity had been her only option. She'd intended to tell Mr. Saloon Thorne about Lily once she arrived, once she could gauge his character, hoping against hope he might understand. His knowing, his calm acceptance was a shock that left her speechless, relief and a profound, wary gratitude warring within her. The wagon ride to the Thorne Ranch was mostly silent. Elias handled the team with an easy competence, pointing out landmarks with brief, matter-of-fact comments. The sun dipped towards the jagged peaks in the distance, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air grew cooler. Sarah, cradling a now sleeping Lily, watched him, trying to reconcile this quiet, accepting man with the stern image she'd half expected. The land around them was vast, beautiful in its ruggedness, but undeniably isolating. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Jed, had given her a pitying look back in Redemption Gulch when Elias had loaded her bag. "Long way from anywhere, ma'am." He'd muttered, loud enough for her to hear, "Hope you like your own company." Thorne mostly does. The comment had sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her, but Elias's calm demeanor beside her now was a small anchor. They arrived at the ranch as twilight deepened. The cabin was small, built of sturdy logs, a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. A dog, a rangy brown hound, bounded out, barking a greeting before wagging its tail furiously at Elias's familiar scent. Inside, a lamp was already lit on a simple wooden table. The room was sparsely furnished but scrupulously clean. A fire glowed in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It felt unexpectedly welcoming. Elias gestured towards a smaller room off the main one. "This will be yours, and the little ones," he said. "It's not much, but it's warm." Sarah stepped inside. There was a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small chest of drawers, and in the corner, a newly made wooden cradle, smooth and smelling faintly of fresh pine. Her breath caught in her throat. He hadn't just known, he had prepared. Tears pricked at her eyes, blurring the sight of the small, perfect haven. She turned, Lily still asleep in her arms. "Mr. Thorne, Elias, thank you." The words felt inadequate. He nodded, a slight flush on his weathered cheeks. "Supper's near ready," he said, turning back to the main room, his gruffness a thin veil over something softer. The initial awkwardness was palpable, a tension of unspoken questions and untested trust. Lily was the silent, innocent center of it all. Sarah knew this fragile piece could shatter. She had to understand how he knew, why he'd still welcome them. The fear of his kindness having unseen limits was a cold knot in her stomach, even as the warmth of the fire seeped into her chilled bones. The next morning, after a night where Lily had fussed only briefly and Sarah had slept more deeply than she had in months, the reality of her new life began to settle. Elias was already up, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filling the small cabin. He moved with a quiet efficiency, stoking the fire, tending to the coffee pot. When Lily awoke, cooing softly, Sarah changed her and brought her into the main room. Elias looked up from the stove, his gaze lingering on the child for a moment before he offered Sarah a hesitant smile. "Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you. Better than I have in a long time." She paused, then gathered her courage. "Elias, about yesterday, about you knowing." He set a plate of bacon and eggs on the table before her. "Eat first, Sarah. We can talk later." His tone brooked no argument, but it wasn't unkind. The day passed in a series of small, practical introductions. He showed her the well, the chicken coop, the small vegetable garden Martha had once tended, now somewhat overgrown. He explained the routines of the ranch, the tasks he managed alone. He didn't assign her chores, merely acquainted her with the workings of the place. Sarah, eager to prove her worth, asked questions, observed, and when Lily napped, she set about tidying the already clean cabin, her hands finding comfort in familiar domestic tasks. She found a mending basket and, seeing a rip in Elias's work shirt slung over a chair, began to repair it. Later that afternoon, as she sat on the porch steps, gently rocking Lily, Elias came and sat on the rail, watching the distant hills. The silence stretched, comfortable rather than strained. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "There was another letter, Sarah, after yours, anonymous. It told me about your situation, about the babe." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Another letter? From whom?" Elias shrugged. "Don't know. Didn't say. Just laid out the facts, asked for understanding." He looked at her then, his denim, blue eyes direct. "When I was a young man, my older sister, she found herself in a similar predicament. Our family, they weren't kind. She lost the child, and a part of herself too. I reckon I never forgot that." He paused, his gaze distant. "And Martha, we wanted children. It just never happened." He cleared his throat, a rough sound. "When that letter came, describing you and the little one, it felt like, well, maybe a chance to do something right, for someone." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, silent and unheeded. It wasn't pity, she realized, or not just pity. It was a deeper empathy, born of his own past hurts and hopes. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "You could have turned me away. No one would have blamed you." "Maybe," he said, looking out at the vast expanse of his land. "But I would have blamed myself. This is a hard land, Sarah. It takes a toll. Sometimes a bit of kindness is the only crop worth raising." He offered her a small, almost shy smile. "Besides, this place could use a woman's touch and a child's laughter. It's been too quiet for too long." That conversation was a turning point. The ever-present fear in Sarah began to recede, replaced by a cautious, burgeoning trust. She still didn't understand the entirety of this quiet, considerate man, but she knew he was fundamentally decent. The first real test of their unconventional arrangement came a week later, on their first trip into Redemption Gulch for supplies. Elias had insisted she accompany him, saying it was best to face the town sooner rather than later. As they walked down the main street, Sarah carrying Lily, she felt the stares like physical blows. Whispers followed them, thinly veiled curiosity and outright disapproval. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose face seemed permanently pursed in judgment, peered at Lily over her spectacles. "Well now, Thorne. Didn't know you were expecting an addition. Two, in fact." Her tone was laden with insinuation. Elias met her gaze coolly. "This is Mrs. Thorne, Sarah. And her daughter, Lily. He didn't elaborate, didn't flinch. His simple statement, delivered with quiet authority, momentarily silenced the woman. He then proceeded to order his supplies, his manner calm and unhurried, offering Sarah small courtesies, asking her opinion on a bolt of calico. Sarah, though her cheeks burned, held her head high, drawing strength from his steadfastness. She saw a flicker of grudging respect in a few faces, though many remained cold. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but Sarah felt a new sense of solidarity with Elias. He hadn't just offered her shelter, he was offering her his public protection. The days settled into a rhythm, dictated by the needs of the ranch and a growing baby. Sarah quickly learned the ways of their small household. She cooked, cleaned, tended the garden with a surprisingly green thumb, coaxing life from the dry soil. She mended Elias's clothes, her neat stitches a quiet testament to her care. She learned to milk the placid Jersey cow Elias kept, her initial nervousness giving way to competence. Lily thrived in the fresh air and with the devoted attention of her mother. She was a sunny-tempered baby, her gurgles and tentative giggles slowly filling the quiet corners of the cabin, chasing away the lingering shadows of Elias's solitude. Elias, in turn, found himself changing. The silence he had once accepted, even cherished, now felt empty when Sarah and Lily were not present. He found himself listening for the sound of Sarah humming as she worked, for Lily's happy shrieks as she played with a wooden spoon on the cabin floor. He taught Sarah to handle a shotgun, for protection against coyotes or worse, his hands brushing hers as he showed her the correct stance, a brief contact that sent an unexpected warmth through him. He fixed the broken rocker on the porch so she could sit and soothe Lily in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky. They rarely spoke of their arrangement or of the future. It was an unspoken agreement, a fragile truce with fate. But Sarah noticed the small things, how Elias always made sure the woodbox was full, how he'd leave a wildflower on the table some mornings, how his eyes would soften when he looked at Lily. She saw the loneliness he carried, the quiet grief for Martha that still surfaced in unguarded moments. She found herself wanting to comfort him, to bring a more permanent light into his life, but fear held her back, fear of overstepping, fear of presuming too much. One evening, as a storm raged outside, trapping them indoors, Lily began to cry, a fretful, inconsolable wail. Sarah walked her, sang to her, tried everything she knew, but the baby's distress only escalated. Elias, who usually kept a respectful distance when Lily was upset, watched them, his brow furrowed. Finally, he rose. "May I?" he asked quietly, holding out his hands. Hesitantly, Sarah passed the crying child to him. Elias cradled Lily against his broad shoulder, his large, work-roughened hand surprisingly gentle as he patted her back. He began to hum, a low, tuneless melody, walking slowly around the small room. Miraculously, Lily's cries began to subside, hiccuping into sniffles, then quiet whimpers. Soon she was asleep, her small face peaceful against his flannel shirt. Sarah watched, a lump in her throat. "You have a way with her," she said softly. Elias looked down at the sleeping child, a tender expression on his face. "My pa used to say I had the magic touch with colicky calves," he said, a rare, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. He carefully laid Lily in her cradle. When he straightened, his eyes met Sarah's. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the storm outside a distant roar, the small cabin a haven of warmth and unspoken emotion. It was a moment of profound connection, a deepening of the bond that had begun with an anonymous letter, and an act of unexpected compassion. The growing ease between them, however, was often punctuated by reminders of the outside world's judgment. During another trip to Redemption Gulch, they encountered the circuit preacher, Reverend Albright, a man known more for his brimstone sermons than his Christian charity. He stopped them outside the mercantile, his gaze stern as it fell upon Sarah, and then lingered on Lily, who was now big enough to sit up in a sling on Sarah's hip and observe the world with wide, curious eyes. "Mr. Thorne," the preacher began, his voice resonant, "I trust you are giving due consideration to the propriety of your current living arrangements. A woman, unwed by your own admission in my hearing, and a child of uncertain parentage under your roof. The good Lord calls us to charity, it is true, but also to righteousness. Tongues are wagging, Thorne. For the sake of this woman's reputation and indeed your own, some formalization would seem appropriate." Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "Reverend, my arrangements are my own concern and Mrs. Thorne's. We are causing no harm and breaking no laws. As for tongues wagging, perhaps you could preach on the sin of gossip next Sunday." The preacher flushed, taken aback by Elias's directness. "I merely offer counsel, Thorne, for the good of your souls." "Our souls are our own to tend, Reverend," Elias replied, his gaze unwavering. He tipped his hat curtly. "Good day." He placed a hand lightly on Sarah's elbow and steered her away, leaving the preacher sputtering in their wake. Back at the ranch, the incident cast a shadow. Sarah felt a familiar cold dread. "He's right, Elias," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she unburdened herself that evening. "People will talk. They'll make Lily's life difficult. Perhaps I should go, find work somewhere else. I can't have her tainted by my situation." Elias, who had been staring into the fire, turned to her, his expression unusually fierce. "Go? Go where, Sarah? Back to whatever you fled from? You think life will be easier for a lone woman with a child anywhere else in this territory? Redemption Gulch may be full of narrow minds, but out here," he gestured around the cabin, "out here, you and Lily are safe. You are respected. You are wanted." The last word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He crossed the small space between them and took her hands. They were cold. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer now, "that preacher doesn't know the first thing about righteousness. What you did, protecting your child, bringing her here to give her a chance, that's as righteous an act as I know. And if this town can't see it, then to hell with this town." He paused. "I won't lie to you. It might not always be easy, but you're not alone in this. We're not alone." His words, his conviction, chipped away at her fear. He was offering more than shelter now. He was offering partnership, a shared defiance against a judgmental world. Yet, the question of formalization, as the preacher had put it, lingered. They were living as man and wife in all but name and legal sanction. The thought of marriage to Elias was a confusing mix of gratitude, practicality, and a shy, burgeoning affection she dared not examine too closely. One afternoon, Sarah was sorting through the small chest of drawers in her room when she found a small velvet-lined box tucked away at the back. Inside, nestled on faded satin, was a simple gold band, Martha's wedding ring. She picked it up, the metal cool against her skin. It was a poignant reminder of the woman whose place she had, in a way, taken. She felt a pang of guilt, of intrusion. Elias found her there, holding the ring, tears in her eyes. He didn't speak, just came and stood beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. "It's Martha's," she whispered. "I know," he said softly. "She would have liked you, Sarah. She had a kind heart." and she would have adored Lily. He gently took the ring from her, and then, just as gently, took her left hand. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before sliding the ring onto her finger. It was a little loose, but it fit. "Perhaps," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "it's time it saw the light of day again. If you'd be willing, Sarah, to make this real, in all ways, for Lily, for us." Sarah looked from the ring on her finger to his earnest, hopeful face. The fear was still there, a faint tremor in the depths of her soul, but it was overshadowed by a wave of warmth, of belonging. This man, who had known her secret from the start, who had offered her refuge and respect when she expected condemnation, was now offering her his name, his life. "Yes, Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes." The decision to truly marry brought a new dynamic to their relationship, a sense of settled purpose. Elias arranged for the circuit judge, a more pragmatic man than Reverend Albright, to perform a simple ceremony at the ranch the next time he passed through the county. There was no fanfare, no guests beyond the judge and his clerk as witnesses. Sarah wore her best mended dress. Elias wore a clean shirt. Lily, oblivious to the momentous occasion, played happily on a quilt at their feet. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Elias took Sarah's hand, the gold band a solid presence on her finger, and a slow smile spread across his face. A smile that reached his eyes and transformed his usually stoic features. Their life didn't change dramatically on the surface. They still worked the ranch, shared meals, cared for Lily. But beneath the surface, a deeper intimacy grew. The small cabin felt more like a home than ever before. The nights were filled with a quiet companionship that blossomed into a tender, hesitant love. Sarah found herself laughing more freely, her past griefs receding. Elias, too, seemed lighter, the burdens of his solitude eased by the presence of his new family. However, the undercurrent of disapproval in Redemption Gulch hadn't vanished. The news of their quiet marriage, when it eventually trickled into town, was met with mixed reactions. Some, like the blacksmith and his wife, offered genuine congratulations. Others, led by the still indignant Mrs. Henderson and a core group of self-appointed moral guardians, remained critical, their whispers now tinged with a resentful acknowledgement of the legality of the union they couldn't openly condemn. The real confrontation, the one Sarah had always dreaded, came unexpectedly. It was a late autumn afternoon. Elias was out checking fence lines, and Sarah was in the small yard, hanging out Lily's freshly washed diapers, the baby herself gurgling happily in a basket nearby. A buggy pulled up, unannounced. From it descended not just Mrs. Henderson, but also Reverend Albright and, to Sarah's dismay, a stern-faced man she vaguely recognized as Mr. Grantham, the chairman of the town council. Mrs. Henderson advanced, her face set in lines of grim satisfaction. "Mrs. Thorne," she began, emphasizing the Mrs. with a sneer, "we've come to have a word with you, and with your husband when he returns." Sarah's heart pounded, but she stood her ground, her hand still holding a damp diaper. "What is it you want, Mrs. Henderson?" "It has come to our attention, Mr. Grantham interjected, his voice officious, "through certain concerned citizens that the child, Lily, may not be, shall we say, wholly yours by birth." He paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "There are whispers, Mrs. Thorne, that you may have acquired her under less than forthright circumstances. Perhaps even that she was abandoned, and you are merely posing as her mother." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. This was a new, insidious attack. "That is a lie," she cried, her voice shaking. "Lily is my daughter. A mother's word is not always proof. especially when a woman's prior circumstances are obscure. Reverend Albright intoned, his eyes cold. There are procedures for orphaned or abandoned children, Mrs. Thorne. The town has a responsibility. A responsibility to interfere in private lives and spread malicious gossip. Elias's voice, hard as granite, cut through the preacher's pronouncement. He had ridden up unnoticed, his face dark with anger. He dismounted in one swift movement, his rifle still in its scabbard, but his presence alone a formidable barrier. He came to stand beside Sarah, his arm going protectively around her shoulders. "Thorne," Grantham said, a little less confidently now, "we are merely trying to ascertain the truth for the child's welfare." The child's welfare. Elias's voice was dangerously low. Lily is loved, she is cared for, she is healthy and happy. She has a mother who would walk through fire for her, and she has a father who will stand by them both against any slander this town cares to throw their way. That is her truth, that is her welfare. Sarah, drawing strength from Elias's fury and his unwavering support, found her own voice, clear and strong despite the tremor in her limbs. "Lily is my daughter," she repeated, looking each of them in the eye. "I carried her, I bore her, and I would die for her. My husband, Elias Thorne, has accepted her as his own. Our marriage is legal, our home is sound. What right do you have to come here and question us, to cast shadows on my child's life with your baseless accusations?" Mrs. Henderson, unwilling to be so easily dismissed, sniffed. "Decent folk have a right to know who they're living amongst. Secrets and deceptions." "The only deception here, madam," Elias interrupted, his gaze pinning her, "is the one you practice on yourselves, calling your petty cruelty and your fear of anything different concern. Sarah came to me honestly about her need for a new life. I knew about Lily before she ever set foot in Redemption Gulch. I knew, and I welcomed them both. It was my choice, my vow, and it is my life. You," he gestured to the three of them, "are trespassing. I suggest you leave my property. Now." His quiet intensity was more intimidating than any shout. Reverend Albright shuffled his feet. Mr. Grantham cleared his throat and looked away, and even Mrs. Henderson seemed to deflate slightly. The wind rustled the drying leaves on the cottonwood nearby, the only sound for a long moment. Then Grantham gave a curt nod. "Very well, Thorne, but if any actual evidence of wrongdoing—" "There is no wrongdoing," Elias stated flatly. "Only a family trying to live in peace. Something you people seem determined to disturb." Without another word, the three unwelcome visitors climbed back into their buggy and drove away, their departure far less self-assured than their arrival. When the buggy was out of sight, Sarah sagged against Elias, the fight draining out of her. He held her close. "They won't be back," he said, his voice still tight with anger, but softening as he looked down at her. "They pushed, and we pushed back harder. They know now we won't break." Lily from her basket let out a cheerful crow, oblivious to the adult drama that had just unfolded. Sarah managed a watery smile, looking from her laughing daughter to her resolute husband. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for believing in me, for fighting for us." He cupped her face, his calloused thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "There's nothing to thank me for, Sarah. We're a family. We protect our own." His eyes held a depth of love and commitment that warmed her to her soul. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also been liberating. They had faced down the worst of the town's prejudice, together, and emerged stronger. The shadows of her past, the fear of exposure, finally seemed to be receding for good. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, A profound sense of peace settled over the Thorn Ranch. Elias and Sarah stood on the porch, watching the last of the buggy's dust settle in the distance. He still had his arm around her, a comforting weight. Lily, sensing the tension had passed, babbled happily from her basket, reaching for a sunbeam. Sarah leaned her head against Elias's shoulder. The fear had been visceral, the old dread rising like a bitter tide, but his strength, his unwavering defense of her and Lily, had been an anchor. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice small. "I know," he said, his lips brushing her hair. "But you were brave, Sarah. You spoke your truth." And they heard it. He looked down at her, a gentle smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "They heard us." A few days later, when Elias went into Redemption Gulch for essential supplies, he noticed a subtle shift. Some townsfolk who had previously offered only curt nods or averted gazes met his eye with a newfound, if hesitant, respect. The blacksmith clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Good on ya, Thorn. Man's gotta stand by his own." Even Mrs. Miller, whose shop Sarah sometimes frequented for thread and notions, offered a small, shy smile and asked kindly after Sarah and the little one. The core of gossips remained, no doubt, but their power seemed diminished, their whispers less potent now that the Thorns had openly defied them and their assumptions. It wasn't universal acceptance, not yet, but it was a start, a crack in the wall of prejudice. Sarah felt the change most keenly within herself. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been her companion for so long began to loosen its grip. She moved with a lighter step, her laughter came more easily, and the shadows under her eyes faded. She was no longer just Sarah, the mail-order bride with a secret child, fleeing a harsh past. She was Sarah Thorne, wife to Elias, mother to Lily, a woman who had found her voice and her place in a world that had once seemed determined to cast her out. She took more active interest in the ranch, discussing plans with Elias, offering suggestions that he, surprisingly often, heeded. Her garden flourished, and she began trading surplus vegetables and eggs with Mrs. Miller for other goods, a small measure of independence and contribution that filled her with pride. The ranch itself seemed to breathe easier, to settle into a comfortable rhythm of shared life. The cabin, once just a shelter, now felt like a true home, filled with the scent of baking bread, the sound of Lily's explorations, and the quiet murmur of Elias and Sarah's conversations in the evenings. They worked side by side, mending fences, tending livestock, preparing for the coming winter, their movements often synchronized, their understanding unspoken. Lily, now a sturdy toddler, was their constant joyful shadow, her world secure and filled with the love of two devoted parents. She called Elias Pa, with an easy affection that made his heart swell. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes, Elias sat on the porch steps, sharpening a knife. Sarah sat beside him, a basket of mending in her lap, Lily asleep in her cradle just inside the open doorway. The air was still, the only sounds the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel and the chirping of crickets. Sarah looked at Elias, at his strong, weathered profile outlined against the fading light, at the gentle way his calloused hands moved. She remembered the fear and desperation that had driven her to answer his advertisement, the terror of arriving with her secret. And then she thought of his quiet words, "I know, ma'am, and it changes nothing." He looked up then, catching her gaze, and offered her that slow, rare smile that always made her heart lift. "Penny for 'em," he said softly. Sarah smiled back. "I was just thinking," she said, "about how far we've come, about how scared I was." "And now?" he prompted. She reached out, laying her hand over his, "And now," she said, her voice full of a quiet, certain joy, "I'm home." He turned his hand, lacing his fingers through hers, his grip firm and reassuring. He hadn't just answered an advertisement, she thought. He had answered the deepest yearning of her heart, and in doing so, perhaps found the answer to his own. The vast, empty landscape around them no longer felt isolating, but protective, a sanctuary they had built together, founded on courage, compassion, and an unexpected love. He is watching her as she moves about their small cabin, a low hum escaping her lips as she tidies away the remnants of their simple supper. Lily, their daughter in every way that matters, sleeps soundly in the cradle he once thought would remain forever empty. The fire crackles, a warm counterpoint to the chill of the prairie night seeping in around the edges of the door. Sarah turns, a soft smile gracing her features as she meets his gaze, and in that moment, Elias Thorne knows a contentment so profound it settles deep in his bones. He had sought a companion, a helper, but life, in its own mysterious way, had given him a family, a love he hadn't dared to hope for again. The arrival of the mail-order bride with her secret child hadn't been the end of his solitude, but the true beginning of his life. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.